Have you ever gotten lost in a totally new city? I mean, like in a place where you barely speak the language. Talking about stressful. Like one time I was in Italy, but anyway. Today we're doing a deep dive into something super practical. We're going to be looking at how to ask for directions and give directions in English, especially if you're a beginner. And get this, the source material for our deep dive today is an episode from an English learning podcast with a name you might need some help pronouncing. It's called Age. Sounds like a challenge. Yeah, you're right though. Asking for directions, it's definitely something like almost everyone needs at some point, no matter what language you're learning.
For sure. So tell me, how does this podcast actually go about teaching this? Like, it's for beginners, right? So I'm guessing they don't just throw you into complex grammar rules. Yeah, you're right. It's really cool how they break it down. So they start with some essential vocabulary, like words like street, corner, intersection, and block, all those words that you need to find your way around, especially in a city. But it's not just a boring list. They give nice and clear explanations of what each word means. And then a really important thing is they actually show you how to use the word in a sentence.
Right. That makes total sense. Because I feel like you could memorize a definition or whatever, but until you see how that word actually works in a real sentence, it doesn't really click.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like that idea of learning in context. You remember new words way better when you see them used in a situation you can relate to.
Definitely. So they've laid the groundwork with that vocab.
Right.
What comes after that?
Oh.
I'm assuming at some point.
Back it up.
But we got to tackle grammar.
Oh, for sure. And this is where it gets really interesting, at least for, people like us who are word nerds. They introduce you to prepositions of place, like little words like on, in, next to, behind, across from, all these small words that can totally change whether you can give good directions or not.
Prepositions. Oh man, I remember those being a nightmare when I was learning Italian. How does this podcast make those less scary for beginners?
Well, first, they explain why prepositions are so important, like how one tiny preposition can completely change the meaning of a whole sentence. They even give a really simple example. They're like, okay, the cat is on the box versus the cat is in the box.
Okay, yeah, that's a classic example. But it definitely makes the point. Even I can't mess that up.
Yeah.
So they've explained the vocabulary, they've touched on the grammar, but how do they actually get learners to USE all this?
All right. This is where they introduce what we call active learning, because it's not enough to just listen passively. You've got to actually practice. And the way they do this is through role playing.
Ooh, role playing. I'm already picturing some awkward but hilarious scenarios. Tell me more about how they set this up.
They create a pretty clear scene. So imagine you're in this busy city, maybe you're feeling a little lost, and you really need to find this restaurant.
Oh yeah, I've been there. Happens to the best of us. Okay, so we're in this lost tourist situation. How does the podcast actually walk us through asking for directions?
It's incredibly well organized. They start with the very basics, like how to politely go up to someone and ask for help. And then they show you some common phrases that you could use to explain what you're looking for. Like, for instance, you could say, "Excuse me, could you tell me how to get to..."
So they're giving us the actual phrases to use. That's so helpful. Because I always find myself trying to translate things.
Yeah.
Word for word in my head.
Yeah, I know, right? Having those phrases ready is so useful. And what I really like is that they don't stop there. They also teach you how to understand the directions you get back. So they go over some common phrases for directions like turn left, go straight, or it's on the corner of.
That's so important.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, even if you manage to ask for directions, understanding the answer can be just as hard.
Exactly. They even give you some example conversations so you can hear what it might sound like in real life. And they encourage you to go beyond just repeating the phrases. They want you to personalize the role play. Choose your own place to find, maybe even add some details from your own life, just to make it more interesting.
Yeah, this is where it goes from being helpful to actually fun. Instead of just drilling vocabulary, you're making up your own little story.
Yeah.
I bet that helps you remember the phrases better too.
Yeah, for sure. That personal connection is so important. Active learning is so much better than just passively listening because it uses more parts of your brain, and that helps you remember things better and for longer.
Wow, that's fascinating. So they've got us talking, asking, understanding. Are there other ways they get you to actively learn besides the role playing?
Yes. Remember those prepositions that were tripping you up earlier? Well, they have fill-in-the-blank exercises that focus on those specifically. So you have to really listen to a sentence. And then choose the right preposition. It's like a little quiz to see if you're getting it.
I like how they use all these different activities. It's not just one method.
Exactly. It's a combination of things that really help you learn. They even have you do some writing. They have this challenge where they ask you to write a paragraph describing how to get to somewhere near you, like maybe your school or your favorite park.
Well, that's a good one. Because then you have to think about the landmarks, the streets, and of course, all those prepositions.
It's a really clever way to put everything together. You're using the vocabulary, the grammar, and even your sense of direction.
This whole approach is really impressive. It seems like the people who made this podcast really get how language learning works. They're not just throwing information at you.
Yeah.
They're taking you through it step by step and giving you the tools to actually use the language.
I couldn't agree more. What stands out to you the most about their teaching style? Like, is there anything you think would be especially interesting to our listener?
You know what strikes me is their tone. They're informative, but they're also really encouraging without being like condescending.
Yeah.
It feels like they're right there with you, cheering you on. And I think that can make a big difference, especially for beginners who might feel intimidated by the whole language learning thing.
You've got a good point there. You can't ignore the emotional side of learning. If you feel supported and motivated, you're way more likely to stick with it.
Definitely. It's like having a friendly guide instead of a strict teacher.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the content of this podcast and their teaching methods. But I'm curious, what about the hosts themselves? Their personalities must play a role in how engaging the whole thing is.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, their energy is contagious. They've got this genuine excitement, even when they're explaining something like prepositions.
Right, like they're really into it. And that makes you more interested as a listener. And they have this great rapport, they joke around a little, they play off each other's energy. It creates this really fun and welcoming vibe.
Yeah, it's almost like you're listening to two friends chat who just happen to love English. And that's a great approach, I think, especially for beginners. It doesn't feel like a boring classroom. It's more relaxed and enjoyable.
I totally agree. They somehow make grammar feel fun.
Okay, so we've talked about how well structured this podcast is, how it uses active learning, and how much personality the hosts bring. What does all this mean for our listener, who's on their own English learning journey?
I think the main takeaway is that learning a language doesn't have to be a drag. This podcast shows how it can be effective and engaging.
It also shows how important it is to find resources that work for you. Like if you're someone who likes interactive activities and real-world scenarios, this kind of approach could be perfect.
Absolutely. And don't forget how important it is to have teachers or resources that make you feel good about learning. That positive energy can make a huge difference in how much you enjoy it and how much progress you make.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a question to think about. How can you use what we talked about today in your own language learning?
Maybe it means looking for resources that use active learning, like the role-playing and writing challenges we discussed. Or maybe it means thinking about the style of the teachers you choose and making sure they create a space where you feel good and supported.
Whatever you choose to do, remember that learning a language is a journey, not a race. Embrace the challenges, celebrate the little wins, and, most importantly, find ways to make it enjoyable. Who knows? You might even find out you love grammar.
You never know. All right, on that note, we'll say goodbye for now. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those ears open for more deep dives into the world of knowledge. Until next time. They actually kind of like paint a picture for you. So imagine you're in this like bustling city, maybe you're feeling a little overwhelmed, and you really need to find a specific restaurant.
Oh yeah, I can totally see that. Okay, so we're in this lost tourist situation. How does the podcast actually walk us through asking for directions?
It's like super well structured. So they start with like the absolute basics, like how to approach someone politely and ask them for help. And then they give you these common phrases that you'd use to explain what you're looking for. Like, excuse me, could you tell me how to get to...
Oh, so they actually give you the phrases to use. That's so practical. I always find myself like trying to translate in my head, and it never works out.
Right. It's way easier to just have those phrases ready. And what I really like is that they don't stop there. They actually teach you how to understand the directions that you get back. So they break down common phrases like turn left, go straight, or like it's on the corner of.
That's so important because sometimes even if you get up the nerve to ask, figuring out the answer is just as hard.
For sure. And get this, They even give you example dialogues, so you can hear how it might sound in a real conversation. But they don't want you to just repeat the phrases. They want you to personalize it. Choose your own destination. Maybe even add details from your life to make it more fun.
I love that. It's like going from helpful to actually fun. You're not just drilling vocabulary. You're making up your own little story.
Right. And I bet that helps you remember things better, too. Active learning like this, it uses more parts of your brain than passive listening, so you remember things better and for longer.
Wow, that's so cool. So they've got us talking, asking questions, understanding directions. What else do they do to encourage this active learning, besides the role-playing?
Well, remember those prepositions that we were talking about earlier. They have fill-in-the-blank exercises that focus specifically on those. So you listen to a sentence, and then you have to choose the right prepositions, like a little test.
Oh, I like that. It's like they build on everything.
Exactly. And then they even add in some writing. They have this challenge where they ask you to write a paragraph describing how to get somewhere near you, like your school or your favorite park.
That's a good one. Because
Yeah.
then you have to think about all the landmarks and stuff. And use all the right prepositions.
Exactly. It's like putting everything you learn together.
This whole approach is really impressive. It seems like they really understand how people learn languages.
I completely agree. What stands out to you the most about how they teach? Is there anything you think would be especially helpful for our listeners?
You know what I really like is their tone. They're really informative, but they're also super encouraging without being condescending.
Yeah.
It feels like they're right there with you, cheering you on. And I think that makes a big difference, especially for beginners.
I agree. The emotional side of learning is really important. If you feel supported and motivated, you're much more likely to keep going.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what this podcast teaches and how they teach it. But I'm also curious about the hosts themselves. Their personalities must play a role in how engaging it is.
Oh yeah, for sure. Their energy is totally contagious. They have this really genuine enthusiasm that just comes through even when they're explaining something as potentially boring as prepositions.
Right. It's like they're actually excited about teaching this stuff. And that makes you as the learner want to listen.
Yeah, and they have this great rapport with each other. They joke around a little bit. They play off each other's energy. It just makes it feel really welcoming and fun.
Yeah, it's almost like you're just listening in on a conversation between two friends who happen to be passionate about English.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really smart approach, especially for beginners. It doesn't feel so formal and intimidating.
Totally. They make grammar feel approachable, which is not an easy thing to do.
Okay, so we've established that this podcast has a really well-structured approach to teaching a practical skill. It incorporates active learning in a bunch of different ways, and the hosts have this awesome combination of expertise and enthusiasm. What does all this mean for our listener who's on their own English learning journey?
I think the biggest takeaway is that learning a language doesn't have to be a chore. This podcast is a perfect example of how it can be effective and engaging at the same time.
And it also shows how important it is to find resources that work for your learning style. If you're someone who likes interactive activities of real-life situations like our listener might be, then this kind of approach could be a game changer.
For sure, and don't underestimate the power of finding teachers or resources that make you feel supported and motivated. The positive energy can make a huge difference in how much you enjoy the process and how much progress you make.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a question to think about: how can you apply the principles we've discussed today to your own language learning?
Maybe it's about looking for resources that use active learning, like the role-playing and writing challenges we talked about. Or maybe it's about paying attention to the style of the teachers you choose and making sure they create an environment that feels positive and encouraging for you.
Whatever path you choose, remember that learning a language is a journey, not a race. Embrace the challenges, celebrate the small victories, and most importantly, find ways to make the process enjoyable. Who knows, you might even discover a hidden passion for grammar along the way.
You never know. And on that note, we'll say goodbye for now. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those ears open for more deep dives into the world of knowledge and discovery. Until next time.